Hey guys, tonight we embark on an epic and often brutal journey, delving into the vast, complex and perpetually fascinating history of Russia, from its enigmatic origins under the legendary Rurik to the seismic upheaval of the 1917 revolution. This isn't just a tale of tsars and peasants, it's a saga of vast landscapes, diverse peoples, relentless expansion, profound suffering, and an enduring national identity forged in the crucible of invasion, religious transformation, and internal strife. We'll witness the birth of a nation from disparate Slavic tribes, the rise of powerful principalities, the crushing yoke of Mongol dominion, the arduous path to imperial greatness, and the internal pressures that ultimately led to the collapse of an ancient dynasty. So before we descend into this often uncomfortable truth, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home, perhaps enduring a long commute, or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection, hidden from the general chaos of life? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Your engagement truly helps us continue to unearth these often forgotten stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper of distant oars cutting through icy northern waters, and the murmur of diverse peoples settling the vast untamed plains of Eastern Europe. Before the emergence of anything resembling Russia, this immense territory was home to a mosaic of East Slavic tribes. These tribes, broadly categorized into groups like the Polans, around Kyiv, Drevlians, northwest of Kyiv, Severians, northeast of Kyiv, Radimichs, Krivichs, and others, inhabited disparate settlements, primarily along the great river systems that would later become vital arteries of commerce and communication, the Dima, the Volga, and the Dvina. These rivers connected the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea and the advanced Byzantine Empire in the south, forming crucial trade routes known collectively as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. The early East Slavs lived in small, often fortified agricultural settlements. Their economy was largely based on subsistence farming, cultivating crops like rye, wheat, barley, and millet, hunting, fishing, and rudimentary crafts like pottery, weaving, and simple metalwork. Their social structures were communal, centered around kin groups and village councils known as Vich or Vechi, which made decisions through collective deliberation among free male members. These gatherings represented a form of proto-democratic governance, particularly strong in later northern centers like Novgorod, where the Vechi held significant power over princely authority. Their religious beliefs were animistic, involving the worship of nature spirits, ancestral veneration, and a pantheon of deities such as Perun, god of thunder, war, and justice, often associated with oaks and lightning, Veles, god of cattle, wealth, commerce, and the underworld, sometimes associated with magic and trickery, and Mokosh, goddess of fertility, weaving, and destiny. Religious practices often involved communal feasts, offerings, and rituals tied to the agricultural cycle, the change of seasons, and natural phenomena. These tribes, while sharing a common linguistic root, Proto-Slavic, and evolving cultural practices, were politically fragmented. They frequently engaged in intertribal skirmishes over land, resources, or tribute, and faced external pressures from powerful neighbors, including the Khazars, a Turkic Khanate to the south, that exacted tribute from some Slavic tribes, e.g. the Polans and Severians, sometimes in the form of furs or slaves, and various Finno-Ugric and Baltic tribes to the north and west. This was a land of immense natural resources, vast forests for timber and furs, fertile river valleys for agriculture, and access to valuable trade commodities, but critically lacking overarching political unity or a sophisticated state apparatus that could consistently defend against external threats or impose widespread order and common law across the disparate communities. It is into this sprawling, decentralized, and often turbulent landscape that the legendary figure of Rurik strides, or rather sails, out of the mists of Scandinavian sagas and the earliest Russian chronicles. The foundational historical text, the primary chronicle, also known as the Tale of Bygone Years, compiled in Kiev around the early 12th century by monks, presents a dramatic origin story for the Rus state. It famously recounts that in the year 862 CE, various East Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes, weary of incessant internal strife, tribal feuds, and a general lack of strong leadership, tribe rose against tribe, leading to no law among them, sent a desperate appeal across the Baltic Sea to the Varangians, a term widely believed to refer to Norsemen or Vikings, specifically Swedes, who were highly active as traders, raiders, and mercenaries in Eastern European waterways, often called Rus themselves. The chronicle's oft-quoted plea states, "Our land is great and abundant, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." In response, Rurik, a chieftain of these Varangian warriors, arrived with his two brothers, Cineas and Trovor, establishing his initial base in Ladoga, an important early trading post at the mouth of the Volkhov River, and then moving to Novgorod, which would quickly become a powerful centre in the north due to its strategic location and access to trade routes. While modern historians continue to debate the precise historicity of Rurik as a single individual, some view him as a composite figure or a symbolic representation of a series of early Viking rulers. Archaeological evidence strongly supports the significant presence and profound influence of Norse warrior traders in the region during this period, 9th–10th centuries. Findings of Scandinavian artifacts, weapons, jewellery, runic inscriptions, burial sites like Gnezdovo, and traces of Viking settlements attest to their widespread activity and integration into the local power structures. These Varangian figures, known to the local Slavs as the Russ, a term thought to be derived from an Old Norse word for men who row, or expedition, referring to their seafaring and riverine activities, or possibly from a Finnic word for Swedes, were highly organised, militarily superior, and driven by a relentless desire for trade, plunder, and tribute. They quickly established a dominant political and economic presence, gradually imposing their rule over the scattered Slavic tribes, organising them into more cohesive proto-states, and integrating them into broader European and Byzantine trade networks. This event in 862 CE is traditionally regarded as the foundational date of the Rus state, the direct precursor to modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Varangian presence not only brought a semblance of order and military protection, often against other raiding groups and internal disorder, but also stimulated the development of urban centres like Novgorod, Kiev, and Polotsk, improved trade infrastructure along the rivers, and introduced new military technologies, superior weaponry and tactics, administrative methods, and a more hierarchical social structure, laying the groundwork for princely rule and a more centralized state. The Varangian influence can be seen in the early names of Rus rulers, Oleg, Igor, Olga, later Christianized to Slavic names like Sviatoslav or Vladimir, the organization of their armed retinues, Druzhina, and their strategic focus on long-distance trade as a primary source of wealth and power. The Varangians' expansion was primarily driven by their pursuit of the immensely lucrative route from the Varangians to the Greeks. This vital trade network stretched from the Baltic Sea via the Neva River, Lake Ladoga, then the Volkhov River and Lake Ilmen, with portages to the Dnieper, down the great river systems, primarily the Dnieper, to the Black Sea, and ultimately to Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire. This route was crucial for exporting northern goods like valuable furs, sable, ermine, beaver, wax, for candles, honey for mead and sweetener, amber, and slaves, often captured Slavic populations from rival tribes, and importing luxury goods, silks, spices, wine, glass, precious metals, and coinage from Byzantium and the sophisticated markets of the East. Kiev, strategically located on the Dnieper, at a crucial crossing point between the northern forests and the southern steppes, quickly became the nexus of this trade. Its commanding position allowed control over river traffic and access to agricultural lands. The most significant consolidation of power came in 882 CE, when Prince Oleg, Rurik's successor, whose exact relationship to Rurik is debated, possibly a close relative, a regent, or a prominent warlord who took control after Rurik's death, seized Kiev from the local Khazar overlords who had previously collected tribute there. Oleg's audacious move, uniting the northern centres Novgorod with the southern Kiev, effectively established Kievan Rus as the dominant power in the region. He further solidified his rule through military campaigns against neighbouring tribes, compelling them to pay tribute, such as the Drevlians and Severians, and by leading daring expeditions against Constantinople itself. These early campaigns, famously culminating in the legendary story of Oleg nailing his shield to the gates of Constantinople, possibly more symbolic than literal, but indicative of successful military pressure, not only brought immense wealth and prestige to Kiev through favourable trade agreements and plunder, but also deepened its cultural and commercial ties with the advanced Byzantine civilization. These early Rus rulers, from Oleg to Igor and Olga, laid the military and economic foundations for what would become the largest state in medieval Europe, extending their influence across a vast geographical area and establishing a dynastic tradition, the Rurikids, that would last for many centuries. The early Rurikid rulers of Kievan Rus developed a complex and evolving system of governance that blended Varangian military organization and tribute extraction with local Slavic customs. They established a system of tribute collection known as polyudi, which involved the Grand Prince and his armed retinue, Druzhina, travelling through their domains each winter to collect furs, honey, wax, slaves, and other valuable goods. This collection process, often accompanied by brutality and sometimes met with fierce resistance. Famously, the Drevlians' murder of Prince Igor in 945 for excessive tribute demands, after which his widow, Princess Olga, exacted a terrible revenge by burying some Drevlian envoys alive, burning others in a bathhouse, and massacring many more, demonstrating the nascent state's capacity for ruthless assertion of authority, gradually integrated the disparate tribes into a single political orbit. Olga, demonstrating both ruthlessness and foresight, began to establish a more systematic approach to tribute collection and administration, organizing hunting grounds and establishing pogosti, administrative centers where tribute was collected and justice was administered, foreshadowing more centralized governance and moving away from the ad hoc polyudi. To manage this vast and increasingly complex territory, the Rurikid dynasty implemented an elaborate, though often volatile, system of succession known as the Lestvichnoi Pravo, or ladder law. Under this system, the senior-most male member of the Rurikid dynasty, typically the eldest surviving brother or uncle, would ideally ascend to the Grand Prince's throne in Kiev, while junior princes moved up a ladder of lesser principalities as they gained seniority. This system, intended to preserve family unity and prevent direct outright civil war for the throne by ensuring all male members of the dynasty had a claim to a principality, paradoxically became a constant source of internal strife and civil war among the numerous Rurikid princes, each jockeying for the most prestigious and lucrative positions. Control over Kiev, with its immense prestige and wealth derived from trade and tribute, became the ultimate prize, leading to frequent shifts in alliances, betrayals, and brutal conflicts between cousins and uncles, often involving calling in foreign mercenaries or allied nomadic tribes. However, the most transformative event in the early history of Kievan Rus was its Christianization. While sporadic contacts with Christianity occurred earlier, Princess Olga, Vladimir's grandmother, famously converted in Constantinople in 957, becoming an early Christian beacon in the pagan land, and attempting to influence her son, Sviatoslav, to convert, though he remained a staunch pagan warrior, famous for his raids on the Khazars and Bulgars, preferring the military lifestyle to religious conversion. The decisive moment came in 988 CE, with Grand Prince Vladimir the Great. Vladimir's conversion was not merely a personal spiritual decision, but a calculated and far-reaching political act. He sought a unifying religion for his vast and diverse realm, one that could provide ideological cohesion, eliminate lingering pagan resistance, and elevate Kievan Rus's standing among the established powers of Europe, connecting it to a prestigious international community of Christian nations. The primary chronicle famously recounts the choice of faiths where Vladimir, after consulting with his boyars and assessing the political landscape, dispatched envoys to various neighbouring lands to learn about their religions. Islam from the Volga Bulgars, whom the envoys found lacking due to prohibitions on alcohol and pork, which Vladimir famously declared joy of the Russes drinking. Judaism from the Khazars, whose kingdom was in decline and statelessness was a negative sign, suggesting God had abandoned them. Western Christianity, Catholicism from the Germans and Romans, which they found unimpressive in its rituals and lack of grandeur, described as no beauty, and Eastern Christianity, Orthodoxy from the Byzantines. The envoys' awestruck account of their experience in the magnificent Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, describing its overwhelming beauty, the sensory richness of its ceremonies, the dazzling mosaics, the ethereal chants, and the sublime Orthodox liturgy. We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, but this much alone we know, that God dwells there among men. We cannot forget that beauty profoundly swayed Vladimir. He ultimately chose Eastern Orthodoxy, embracing it as the unifying faith for his vast and diverse realm. Following his personal baptism, likely in Chersonesus, Crimea, as part of a strategic alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, in exchange for military aid and marriage to the emperor's sister, Anna Porphyrogenita, a highly prestigious match, Vladimir returned to Kiev and orchestrated the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River, famously ordering the destruction of pagan idols, like the prominent statue of Peron, and the construction of new Christian churches. The forced nature of this conversion, particularly for the common people, who were often coerced into the new faith and clung to pagan traditions for centuries, alongside the new faith, a phenomenon known as dovivory, or dual faith, should not be overlooked. Yet its long-term impact on the identity and development of race was undeniably monumental. The adoption of Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium had profound and multifaceted consequences that irrevocably shaped the future of Kievan Rus and its successor states for centuries, creating a distinctive East Slavic civilization that would chart its own course, distinct from Western Europe. Culturally, it brought the rich, sophisticated legacy of Byzantine art, e.g. icon painting, mosaic and fresco techniques, highly stylized and symbolic, focusing on spiritual transcendence. Architecture, the cruciform dome church, characterized by its central dome and 4 radiating arms, symbolizing the cross, sophisticated church music, chanting, literature, hagiography, sermons, chronicles, and legal traditions. Byzantine canon law influenced the Russkaya Pravda. Monasteries, such as the Kiev-Pechursk Lavra cave monastery founded in 1051, became vital centers of learning, literacy, and scholarship, meticulously preserving ancient texts, compiling chronicles, like the primary chronicle itself, offering a unique native perspective on early history, and fostering intellectual life. They also served as centers of spiritual solace, pilgrimage, economic activity, and even refuge for those fleeing turmoil. The Cyrillic alphabet, adapted from Greek by Saint Cyril and Methodius for Slavic languages, was adopted, enabling the translation of religious texts from Greek into Old Church Slavonic, the creation of a vast liturgical literature, and the development of a distinct written East Slavic culture that spread literacy beyond the immediate clerical class, albeit slowly. Spiritually, Orthodox Christianity provided a powerful unifying ideology, helping to integrate the disparate Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes under a common faith, linking them directly to the venerated Christian civilization of Byzantium, and giving them a shared worldview that transcended tribal loyalties. It introduced concepts of divine kingship, fostering the idea of the ruler as a sacred figure, the God-appointed sovereign, which would later be crucial for the development of Russian autocracy and the Third Rome ideology, Moscow as the successor to Rome, and Constantinople. Politically, it cemented a distinct East Slavic identity, setting it apart from the Catholic West, which had experienced the Great Schism of 1054, formally dividing Latin and Greek Christianity, and the Islamic South. The close relationship with the Constantinople Patriarchate, rather than the Pope in Rome, meant that Kievan Rus developed a strong sense of its own ecclesiastical independence, laying the groundwork for the future autocephaly self-governance of the Russian Orthodox Church. This religious choice would prove to be a defining characteristic of Russian civilization for centuries, deeply influencing its worldview, political thought, particularly the concept of the Tsar as God's anointed ruler, and the idea of Russia as the protector of orthodoxy, and artistic expression, which would remain largely distinct from Western European artistic trends, emphasizing spiritual depth, symbolic meaning, and a certain conservatism over secular realism and innovation. The period following Vladimir's conversion, particularly under his son Yaroslav the Wise, reigned 1019 to 1054, is universally regarded as the golden age of Kievan Rus. Yaroslav, a highly capable and visionary ruler, consolidated power, expanded the state's borders, and engaged in extensive diplomatic relations with various European powers, cementing Kiev's status as a major regional player on the European stage. He married his daughters to European royalty, e.g. Yaroslavna to King Henry I of France, Elizabeth Yaroslavna to King Harald Hardrada of Norway, forging powerful dynastic alliances that stretched across the continent, enhancing Kiev's prestige and influence. He promoted literacy and scholarship with fervour, founding numerous schools and libraries, including one attached to the St. Sophia Cathedral, and commissioning the translation of Greek texts into Slavonic. Under his patronage, the arts and crafts flourished, and artisans produced exquisite jewellery, icons, illuminated manuscripts, and intricate metalwork. He oversaw a remarkable building program, especially in Kiev, where he constructed magnificent churches, most notably the stunning St. Sophia Cathedral, a masterpiece of Byzantine architecture adorned with breathtaking mosaics and frescoes, and the Golden Gate, a fortified entrance into the city designed to impress visitors with Kiev's wealth and power. This cathedral was not only a religious centre, but also a powerful symbol of the state's newfound spiritual and cultural grandeur, often compared to its namesake in Constantinople. Yaroslav also codified the first comprehensive legal system of Kievan Rus, the Russkaya Pravda, Justice of Rus, a collection of laws outlining rights, responsibilities and punishments, covering everything from property rights and inheritance to criminal offences and judicial procedures. This legal framework provided a vital structure for governance and justice in the sprawling realm, contributing to a period of relative peace and stability. Under Yaroslav, Kiev became one of the largest and most prosperous cities in Europe, a vibrant hub of trade, culture and religious life, renowned for its intellectual pursuits, its beautiful golden-domed churches and its bustling markets. The city's wealth was evident in its numerous stone buildings, a rarity in northern Europe at the time, and its diverse population included merchants, artisans, and scholars from across Eurasia. Diplomatic ties were extensive, connecting Kiev to Byzantium, the Holy Roman Empire, Scandinavia, Hungary, and Poland. However, despite this apparent strength and flourishing culture, the seeds of future fragmentation were already deeply sown. Yaroslav's aforementioned succession policies, while intended to prevent direct, outright civil war for the throne, paradoxically contributed to long-term instability. The Lestvichnaya Pravo ensured that princely power was distributed among family members, but it also meant constant shifting of power centres, alliances and warfare, as princes jockeyed for better positions or the coveted Kiev throne. Younger princes, ambitious and impatient, often challenged their elders, leading to a complex web of rivalries, betrayals, and shifting allegiances. These incessant internal squabbles, combined with the increasing decline of the Dnieper trade route due to shifting geopolitical realities, the Crusades opening new Mediterranean routes that bypassed Eastern Europe, and new trade routes emerging in Western Europe through the Hanseatic League and overland routes to Germany, and the constant debilitating threat from nomadic incursions from the southern steppes, such as the Pechenegs, who were eventually overcome, and later the formidable Cumans/Polovtsians, who repeatedly cut off trade routes, ravaged settlements and destabilized the fertile southern regions, gradually weakened the central authority of Kiev. The Grand Princely title in Kiev, once a symbol of paramount authority, became increasingly nominal, a prize that changed hands frequently rather than a stable seat of power. Powerful local princes began to establish more independent power bases in other regions, leveraging their local resources and strategic positions. This led to the rise of new powerful regional centers like the Merchant Republic of Novgorod in the far north, with its unique Veshy system, powerful merchant class and vast fur trade networks stretching to the Arctic and Baltic Sea, and the increasingly autocratic Principality of Vladimir Suzdal in the northeastern forests, benefiting from agricultural expansion, relative isolation from steppe raids, and a more centralized princely authority focused on consolidating land and power. Each of these emerging centers developed its own distinctive political and economic character, increasingly asserting their autonomy from Kyiv and competing for overall leadership of the Rus lands. The golden age of Kyiv, while undeniably glorious, was ultimately finite. Its decline set the stage for a prolonged period of decentralization and political splintering, leaving the once unified Rus vulnerable and exposed. This internal fragmentation tragically coincided with the rise of an overwhelming, unforeseen force from the east, a force that would profoundly alter the course of Russian history for centuries to come, transforming its political landscape and cultural trajectory in ways that are still felt today. The decentralized nature of Rus at the moment of invasion meant there was no single strong leader or unified army to stand against the coming storm. The internal fragmentation of Rus proved fatal, as a terrifying, unforeseen force surged from the east. The stage was tragically set for the Mongol invasion, a cataclysm that would reshape the very identity of the Russian lands, and fundamentally redirect its development away from the trajectories of Western European states, setting it on a unique historical path, often viewed as distinct and isolated from the rest of Europe. The decentralized nature of Rus at the moment of invasion meant there was no single strong leader or unified army to stand against the coming storm. From the depths of Central Asia emerged the Mongol Empire, forged by the military genius and ruthless ambition of Genghis Khan. By the early 13th century, his successors had inherited an unparalleled fighting machine, armies of highly disciplined mobile cavalry, masters of strategic maneuver, psychological warfare, and brutal siege tactics, honed through conquests across Asia. Their reputation for total destruction of any city or region that dared to resist preceded them, sowing terror and disunity among their targets. The first fateful encounter between the Russar and the Mongols occurred in 1223 at the Battle of the Kalka River. A scouting force of Mongol generals, Subutai and Jebi, engaged a combined Rus princely army, allied with their former enemies, the Cumans Polovtsians, who had appealed for help. Despite a momentary numerical advantage, the deep-seated disunity, lack of coordinated command, and internal jealousies among the Rus princes led to a crushing defeat. Many princes were captured and brutally executed, and their armies were annihilated. This battle served as a terrifying preview of Mongol military superiority and their sheer ruthlessness. However, to the great but temporary relief of the Rus, the Mongols, after this initial foray, unexpectedly retreated eastward, leaving the principalities a brief but ultimately squandered reprieve. The Rus rulers failed to fully grasp the magnitude of the threat, or to unite in preparation for the inevitable return of these formidable warriors. They returned to their internecine squabbles, rather than forging alliances against the common enemy. The full force of the Mongol invasion descended upon Rus in 1237, led by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, commanding a massive and disciplined army, often estimated to be over 100,000 strong. This was not a raid, but a systematic conquest aimed at integrating the Rus lands into the burgeoning Mongol Empire. One by one, the isolated and fragmented Rus principalities fell before the overwhelming Mongol onslaught, unable to offer sustained, coordinated resistance. The campaign began in the frosty December of 1237. The city of Ryazan was the first major centre to face the full horror, utterly destroyed after a brutal 6-day siege, its inhabitants massacred, and the city razed to the ground, leaving no survivors. Then followed Kolomna, Moscow, then a minor frontier town, but strategically important for its position on river routes, and in February 1238, the powerful capital of Vladimir Suzdal. Vladimir was taken after a short but fierce resistance. The city was plundered, its magnificent cathedrals burned, including the Dormition Cathedral, and its inhabitants massacred or enslaved. Many other cities, including the stubbornly resistant Kozelsk, which held out for 7 weeks before being completely wiped off the map, earning it the chilling Mongol epithet, Evil City, for its fierce defense, suffered similar fates, leaving only ruins and mass graves. The Mongols then turned north, but the spring thaw, which turned roads into impassable mud, Rasputitsa, and the dense forests which hampered cavalry movements, prevented them from reaching Novgorod, which was spared direct conquest, but forced into tributary status. In the south, the Mongols regrouped and moved toward the heart of Old Rus. In 1240, after a prolonged and desperate siege, Kiev, once the glorious spiritual and political centre of Rus, was utterly devastated. Its population was massacred, its buildings razed, and its cultural treasures destroyed. Contemporary chroniclers, such as the Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, described the city as reduced to nothing but bones and skulls, a desolate wasteland of once thriving communities. The fall of Kiev symbolized the definitive end of the Kiev-on-Rus era and the grim beginning of the Mongol yoke. The period of Mongol rule over Rus, lasting for over 2 centuries, from the mid-13th to the late 15th century, is known in Russian historiography as the Tatar yoke. After the Tars, a Turkic group who formed a significant part of the Mongol forces that settled in the western part of the Mongol Empire. Unlike their direct rule in Central Asia or China, the Mongols generally did not directly administer Rus lands. Instead, they maintained indirect control through a rigorous system of tribute collection and political vassalage. Rus princes were required to travel thousands of kilometers to the horde's capital, Sarai, located on the lower Volga River, to receive a yarlik or patent from the Khan, confirming their authority to rule their specific principality. This system fostered intense competition and subservience among the Rus princes, who often bribed, flattered, or even denounced rivals to the Khan to gain an advantage over their competitors, ensuring that the Rus remained divided and easily controlled. The Grand Prince of Vladimir, who held the Yarlik for the most senior princely position, though the actual power often lay elsewhere, became the chief tax collector for the Mongols, responsible for gathering the heavy tribute, the vikod or output from all Rus lands, and delivering it to the horde. Mongol baskaks, tax collectors and military overseers, were stationed in major cities to ensure compliance and enforce Mongol law, though their direct presence diminished over time as Rus princes became more reliable in collecting and delivering the tribute. Regular censuses were conducted by Mongol officials to accurately assess the taxable population and wealth, making tribute collection more efficient and inescapable. Any failure to pay or attempt at rebellion was met with brutal punitive expeditions, rati that laid waste to vast areas and further devastated the population. The impact of the Mongol yoke on Rus was profound and multifaceted, leaving an indelible mark on its future trajectory. Economically, it was devastating. The constant demands for tribute, often collected with brutal efficiency and enforced by punitive expeditions, drained immense wealth from the land, hindering economic development for generations. Trade routes were disrupted, and the repeated destruction of cities and agricultural lands led to widespread famine, depopulation, and a general regression of urban life and sophisticated crafts. Many artisans and skilled labourers were either killed or forcibly relocated to the Mongol capital, leading to a loss of specialised knowledge and artistic traditions that had flourished in Kievan Rus. This economic stagnation and demographic decline significantly retarded Rus's development compared to Western Europe. Culturally, Rus became largely isolated from Western Europe, missing out on the transformative intellectual and artistic currents of the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and the early stages of the scientific revolution. Its development diverged significantly from the West, reinforcing its unique Orthodox Christian identity, but also contributing to a sense of cultural and technological lag that would require centuries to overcome. The brutality of Mongol rule, combined with their centralized autocratic system and the practice of demanding absolute obedience from their vassals, is also argued by some historians to have profoundly influenced the development of future Russian absolutism, instilling a deep-seated fear of anarchy and a preference for strong, centralized authority to prevent future foreign domination. The experience of the yoke arguably contributed to a more authoritarian political culture in the long run, emphasizing the necessity of a strong, unified ruler. Religiously, however, the Orthodox Church largely prospered under Mongol rule. The Mongols, being broadly tolerant of all religions, as long as they prayed for the Khan's well-being and loyalty, granted the Church significant tax exemptions and privileges. This was codified in special charters, known as yarliks, that protected church lands, clergy, and spiritual authority from Mongol interference. This allowed the Church to accumulate wealth, expand its landholdings, and gain immense moral authority, becoming a powerful unifying force and a repository of Russian identity during the long years of foreign domination. Monasteries, often located in remote areas, became centers of spiritual solace, cultural preservation, copying manuscripts, maintaining chronicles, promoting literacy, and even refuge for those fleeing the Mongol devastation. The Church actively promoted the idea of unity and spiritual resistance, preserving the cultural and religious continuity of the Rus people and quietly nurturing the idea of eventual liberation. The Metropolitan of the Russian Orthodox Church, the head of the Russian Church, also relocated his seat from Vladimir to Moscow in the early 14th century, a decision that would prove immensely significant for Moscow's future prestige and its claim as the new spiritual center of Rus. This symbiotic relationship between the Church and the nascent Muscovite state would become a cornerstone of future Russian power. The long-term political consequences were perhaps the most significant, and ironically, the Mongol yoke inadvertently contributed to the rise of Moscow. Located in the relatively secluded and forested northeastern region, away from the main invasion routes and the active steppe frontier, Moscow was initially a minor principality, largely overlooked by the devastating initial Mongol sweeps. However, its early princes, particularly Daniel Alexandrovich, son of Alexander Nevsky, and his successors like Ivan Furkalita, Moneybags, reigned 1325 to 1340, proved to be remarkably astute and pragmatic in their dealings with the Golden Horde. They consistently demonstrated loyalty to the Khans, meticulously paid their tributes on time, and often served as diligent tax collectors for the Mongols from other Rus principalities. This cooperative stance earned them the Khan's favour, including the highly coveted Yarlik for the Grand Prince of Vladimir, which conferred nominal seniority over all Rus lands and, crucially, responsibility for collecting the pan-Rus tribute. This not only provided Moscow with immense financial resources, as they could skim off a portion, but also gave them a legitimate pretext to interfere in the affairs of other principalities, often suppressing rivals on behalf of the Horde, thereby weakening them. Moscow's geographical location also played a critical role. Situated at the crossroads of several important river routes, Moskva-Oka, Volga tributaries, and at the center of a rich agricultural region in the relatively safe forest zone, it became a magnet for population migration from the more exposed southern and western lands, which were still prone to devastating raids. This influx of population provided a growing labor force, soldiers and taxpayers. Moscow's princes actively encouraged this migration, offering incentives and protection. The relocation of the Metropolitanate of all Rus to Moscow in 1328, initially by Metropolitan Peter, solidified by Metropolitan Theognostus, was a pivotal moment, cementing Moscow's spiritual authority and making it the de facto religious capital of Rus. This greatly enhanced Moscow's prestige and gave its princes invaluable moral and political leverage over other Rus principalities, effectively sanctioning their leadership in the eyes of the Orthodox populace. Through a combination of strategic alliances with the Horde, shrewd diplomacy, military strength, and the accumulation of wealth and spiritual authority, Moscow gradually eclipsed its rivals, particularly the powerful Principality of Tver. The rivalry between Moscow and Tver for the Grand Prince's title was intense, marked by assassinations, betrayals, and appeals to the Mongol Khans. Moscow consistently outmaneuvered Tver, often with Mongol backing, ultimately securing its preeminent position. By the mid-14th century, Moscow was undeniably the leading Rus principality, laying the groundwork for the eventual reunification of the Rus lands under its banner and the ultimate liberation from the Mongol yoke. The centuries of Mongol rule, though devastating, had paradoxically created the conditions for a new, centralized Russian state to emerge, one that would carry forward the legacy of orthodoxy and a strong autocratic rule, forever shaped by the crucible of its unique historical experience. The centuries of Mongol rule, though devastating, had paradoxically created the conditions for a new, centralized Russian state to emerge, one that would carry forward the legacy of orthodoxy and a strong autocratic rule, forever shaped by the crucible of its unique historical experience. As Moscow solidified its position, the once unassailable power of the Golden Horde began its slow, inexorable decline, setting the stage for Russia's liberation. The decline of the Golden Horde was a protracted process, spanning much of the 14th and 15th centuries, marked by severe internal strife and external pressures. A series of devastating succession crises, often accompanied by assassinations and civil wars among rival claimants to the Khanate, severely weakened its central authority. This period, known as the Great Troubles within the Horde itself, fragmented its power and made it increasingly difficult to enforce unified control over its vast tributary lands. Furthermore, the devastating impact of the Black Death in the mid-14th century swept through the steppe, decimating the Mongol population and further eroding their military and administrative capacity. Simultaneously, new power centres emerged on the Horde's periphery. The rising Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the west actively absorbed former Rus lands such as Kiev and Smolensk, and various Turkic tribes began to assert their independence, leading to the formation of rival Khanates like the Crimean Khanate, Kazan Khanate, and Astrakhan Khanate, all vying for regional dominance and further splintering the once unified Mongol power. Against this backdrop of Mongol decline, Moscow began its cautious but determined policy of consolidating power and subtly challenging the Horde's authority. While still paying tribute, Moscow's princes, particularly Dmitry Ivanovich, later known as Dmitry Donskoy, reigned 1359 to 1389, started to accumulate military strength and political influence. Dmitry, through his astute diplomacy and by leveraging the growing weakness of the Horde, began to openly defy Mongol mandates, particularly when the Horde was experiencing one of its frequent internal power struggles. The symbolic turning point came in 1380 with the Battle of Kulikovo Field. This battle was not fought for complete independence from the yoke, but it was a crucial demonstration of Moscow's rising military might and its ability to unite a significant number of Rus princes under its leadership against a common enemy. Dmitry gathered a large combined Rus army, estimated to be around 50,000 to 100,000 men, and decisively defeated the forces of Mamai, a powerful Mongol warlord who effectively controlled the Horde at that time. While the victory at Kulikovo did not immediately end the Mongol yoke, 2 years later in 1382, Khan Tokhtamysh of the Golden Horde launched a punitive expedition, sacking Moscow and re-establishing tribute payments. It profoundly boosted the morale and self-confidence of the Rus people. It proved that the Mongols were not invincible, and that a unified Rus under Muscovite leadership could defeat them. It instilled a powerful sense of national identity and a conviction that liberation was possible. Dmitry Donskoy, through his leadership in this battle, became a national hero and solidified Moscow's moral and political claim as the undisputed leader in the struggle for Russian independence. Following Kulikovo, Moscow's policy of gathering of the Russian lands intensified. This was a long, often ruthless process that involved a combination of strategic marriages, the purchase of smaller principalities often using the very tribute money collected for the Horde, diplomatic pressure, and outright military conquest. Princes of Moscow systematically absorbed neighbouring territories like Yaroslavl, Rostov, and part of Nizhny Novgorod. This expansion was driven by a desire for greater land, resources, and manpower, but also by the growing ideological conviction that Moscow, as the protector of Orthodox Christianity and the inheritor of Kievan Rus's legacy, had a sacred duty to unite all fragmented Rus's lands. The Church continued to play a pivotal role in this process, actively supporting Moscow's political aspirations. The relocation of the Metropolitanate to Moscow earlier in the 14th century provided invaluable spiritual legitimacy, reinforcing Moscow's status as the sole unifying center of Rus. The Metropolitan often acted as a powerful mediator and advocate for Moscow, using his religious authority to condemn princely rivalries and promote unity under the Muscovite banner. The final liberation from the Mongol yoke came under Ivan III Vasilievich, known as Ivan the Great, reigned 1462 to 1505. Ivan III was a shrewd, patient, and exceptionally determined ruler, often considered the true founder of the centralized Russian state. By his reign, the Golden Horde was severely weakened, fractured into several smaller, mutually hostile khanates. Capitalizing on this disarray, Ivan III progressively reduced tribute payments, and in 1476, he formally renounced all payments to the Horde. This act of defiance culminated in the Great Stand on the Ugra River in 1480. Facing a large army led by Khan Ahmet of the Great Horde, Ivan III positioned his forces on one side of the Ugra River, while the Mongols stood on the other. For weeks the two armies faced each other across the river, neither daring to make the first decisive move. This bloodless confrontation, a standoff rather than a battle, ended when Khan Ahmet, facing a lack of supplies, the onset of winter, and the desertion of his Lithuanian allies, finally withdrew his forces. This withdrawal marked the formal end of the Mongol yoke. After 240 years of foreign domination, Russia was now truly independent, free to pursue its own destiny without external overlords. The psychological impact of this liberation was immense, signifying a new era of sovereignty and national self-assertion. With the yoke lifted, Ivan III dedicated himself with renewed vigour to the consolidation of Muscovite power and the expansion of the newly independent state. He systematically integrated the remaining independent Rus principalities and territories. His most significant territorial acquisition was the conquest of the powerful and wealthy merchant republic of Novgorod the Great in 1478. Novgorod, with its strong traditions of self-governance, Veshi, and its vast trading empire, represented a significant alternative model of development to Moscow's autocracy. Ivan III brutally suppressed Novgorod's independence, abolishing its Veshi assembly, confiscating vast church and boyar lands, and forcibly resettling thousands of leading Novgorodian families to Moscow or other parts of his realm. Replacing them with Muscovite loyalists, this act definitively eliminated a major rival and brought immense wealth and strategic territory under Moscow's direct control. He also annexed Taifa, 1485, and other smaller principalities, effectively uniting most of the great Russian lands under a single ruler in Moscow. Under Ivan III, the Muscovite state began to transform into a nascent empire. He started to adopt the title of Sovereign of all Rus, Gosudar Vesaya Rusi, reflecting his claim over all East Slavic lands, including those under Lithuanian rule. He also began to use the title of Tsar, Caesar, a term that implicitly claimed succession to the Roman and Byzantine emperors, though it would not be officially adopted by his grandson, Ivan IV. This move was strongly influenced by the emerging Third Rome ideology. After the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Moscow began to see itself as the rightful successor to the Eastern Orthodox spiritual and political legacy. The theory proclaimed, "Two Romes have fallen, a third stands, and a fourth there shall not be." This ideology asserted Moscow's unique role as the last bastion of true orthodoxy, inheriting the divine mission of Byzantium and bestowing upon its ruler a sacred, universal authority. This concept profoundly shaped Russia's self-perception and its messianic role in world history. Ivan III's marriage to Sophia Palaiologina, Zoe Palaiologina, in 1472, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, further cemented this ideological claim. This marriage brought not only dynastic prestige, but also an influx of Byzantine court rituals, symbols, and architectural styles to Moscow. The double-headed eagle, the ancient symbol of the Byzantine Empire, was adopted as the state emblem of Muscovy, representing the Tsar's temporal and spiritual authority and the dual orientation of Russia towards both East and West. Italian architects and craftsmen, notably Aristotle Fioravanti, were invited to Moscow, bringing Renaissance architectural techniques that transformed the Kremlin, building magnificent new cathedrals like the Dormition Cathedral in the Kremlin, which became the coronation church for Russian monarchs, and palaces, consciously emulating the grandeur of Constantinople and Rome. The consolidation under Ivan III marked the birth of a powerful, centralized, autocratic state. A new Muscovite bureaucracy began to form, and a new legal code, the Serdobnik of 1497, was promulgated, standardizing legal procedures and punishments across the expanding realm. The landholding system also underwent significant changes, with the rise of the Pompesti system, where land was granted to servicemen, Dymvorien, in return for military service, laying the groundwork for the future Russian nobility and a service state. The end of the Mongol yoke was not merely a political event, it was the definitive moment when Muscovy emerged from the shadow of foreign domination to become a sovereign power, laying the foundations for the future Tsardom of Russia and its vast territorial expansion. This powerful unified state, forged in the crucible of Mongol subjugation and Orthodox faith, was now ready to assert itself on the global stage, facing new challenges and opportunities. The consolidation under Ivan III marked the birth of a powerful, centralized, autocratic state. This powerful, unified state, forged in the crucible of Mongol subjugation and Orthodox faith, was now ready to assert itself on the global stage, facing new challenges and opportunities. The transition from a grand principality to a fully fledged Tsardom would be completed by his grandson, Ivan IV, whose reign would prove to be one of the most transformative and terrifying in Russian history, followed by a period of profound chaos known as the Time of Troubles, from which a new dynasty would eventually emerge. The immediate successor to Ivan III was his son, Vasily III, reigned 1505 to 1533. Vasily continued his father's policies of gathering of the Russian lands and strengthening the centralized Muscovite state. He successfully annexed the last remaining independent Rus principalities, including Pskov in 1510 and Ryazan in 1521, bringing virtually all ethnically Russian territories under Moscow's direct control. His most significant achievement was the capture of Smolensk from Lithuania in 1514, a strategic fortress that opened the way to Western Rus and marked a major victory against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, solidifying Moscow's western borders. Vasily III maintained the autocratic tendencies of his father, further curtailing the power of the old boyar aristocracy and strengthening the service nobility, Dvorianstvo, who owed their landholdings, Pomestier, directly to their service to the Tsar. During his reign, the ideology of Moscow as the Third Rome continued to develop, influencing state symbolism and the ruler's self-perception. Vasily died relatively young, leaving behind a young son, Ivan IV, who would inherit the throne and plunge Russia into an era of unprecedented centralization and terror. The reign of Ivan Vafasievich, later known as Ivan the Terrible, reigned 1533, began under tumultuous circumstances. As he was only 3 years old upon his father's death, a series of regencies and brutal power struggles among the powerful boyar families, primarily the Shuiskys and Belskys, characterized his early years. Ivan endured neglect, abuse, and witnessed violence and betrayal, experiences that profoundly shaped his psyche and instilled in him a deep distrust and paranoia towards the boyar class. This chaotic upbringing, combined with his inherited autocratic tendencies and a fervent belief in his divine right to rule, laid the psychological groundwork for his later tyrannical actions. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan made history by formally being crowned not as a Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all Rus in the Dormition Cathedral in Moscow. This coronation was a deliberate and highly symbolic act, explicitly affirming Moscow's claim as the successor to Byzantium, and asserting the Tsar's imperial and divinely ordained authority over all Russian lands, distinct from his European counterparts. Ivan's early reign, from 1547 to about 1560, is often considered a period of constructive reform and relative stability, guided by a council of advisors known as the Chosen Council, Izbranaya Rada. During this time, Ivan initiated significant reforms aimed at strengthening the state and legal system. He convened the First Zemski Sobor, Assembly of the Land, in 1549, a type of national assembly composed of representatives from different social classes, to discuss state affairs and legitimize new policies, thereby broadening the base of support for his rule, at least initially. A new legal code, the Sudebnik of 1550, was promulgated, updating and expanding upon Ivan III's code, standardizing legal procedures and reinforcing the Tsar's authority. Military reforms were also undertaken, establishing the Streltsy Musketeers, a permanent infantry force, and improving artillery. However, Ivan's early reign is most remembered for its dramatic territorial expansion. In 1552, after a prolonged siege and fierce resistance, Ivan IV conquered the Khanate of Kazan. This was a monumental victory, not only securing Russia's eastern borders, but also giving Moscow control over the entire middle Volga River region, opening up vital trade routes and vast new territories for colonization. This triumph was seen as a victory of Orthodox Christianity over Islam and deeply resonated with the Third Rome ideology. Just 4 years later, in 1556, Ivan also conquered the Khanate of Astrakhan, gaining control of the entire Volga River down to the Caspian Sea and establishing Russian influence in the Caucasus region. These conquests transformed Muscovy into a truly multi-ethnic and multi-confessional empire, extending its reach far beyond the historical lands of Rus. The mid-1550s also saw the beginning of Russia's expansion eastward into Siberia. Driven by the fur trade and led by figures like the Stroganov merchants. While full conquest was yet to come, the groundwork for a vast Siberian empire was being laid. Despite these successes, Ivan's foreign policy in the west proved disastrous. In 1558, he initiated the Livonian War, aiming to gain access to the Baltic Sea and establish direct trade routes with Western Europe. This prolonged and brutal conflict, lasting for 25 years until 1583, pitted Russia against a powerful coalition of powers, including the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Sweden, and Denmark. The war drained Russia's resources, devastated its northwestern regions, and ultimately ended in a crushing defeat, denying Russia vital access to the Baltic. The immense cost and failure of this war contributed significantly to Ivan's growing paranoia and the radicalization of his rule. The period from 1565 to 1572 saw the implementation of the infamous Oprichnina, a policy that epitomized Ivan's reign of terror. Driven by his deep-seated paranoia, his desire for absolute, unquestioned autocratic power, and his conviction that the boyars were conspiring against him, Ivan divided his realm into two parts: the Zemshchina, the regular state, and the Oprichnina, the separate or personal domain of the Tsar. The Oprichnina was administered by the Oprichniki, a loyal, black-clad, often fanatical private army and secret police force, who rode on horseback with a dog's head and a broom attached to their saddles, symbolizing their mission to sniff out and sweep away treason. These Oprichniki were granted vast powers, confiscating boyar lands, executing suspected traitors, and terrorizing the population. Cities like Novgorod were brutally sacked in 1570, with widespread massacres and torture based on fabricated accusations of treason. The Oprichnina effectively destroyed the power of the old hereditary boyar aristocracy, replacing them with a new service nobility, loyal only to the Tsar. While it successfully centralized power in Ivan's hands and eliminated political opposition, it did so at an immense cost. It devastated the Russian economy, depopulated vast tracts of fertile land as peasants fled the terror, weakened the state's military capacity, and left a legacy of fear and arbitrary rule that would profoundly shape Russian political culture for centuries. The exact motivations behind the Oprichnina remain debated by historians, but its devastating impact is undeniable. Ivan's personal life was also marked by tragedy and violence. in a fit of rage in 1581, he struck his eldest son and heir Ivanovich with a staff, causing his death. This act left his mentally challenged son Fyodor as the next in line, further destabilizing the succession. Ivan IV died in 1584, leaving behind a vastly expanded but deeply traumatized and economically ravaged state, teetering on the brink of chaos. The death of Ivan IV marked the end of an era and the beginning of a profoundly turbulent period in Russian history, known as the Time of Troubles, 1598 to 1613. His successor, Fyodor I, reigned 1584, was pious but weak-willed and possibly mentally infirm, leaving actual power in the hands of his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. Fyodor's reign saw the formal establishment of the Patriarchate of Moscow in 1589, elevating the head of the Russian Orthodox Church to an independent patriarch, signalling Russia's full spiritual autonomy. However, Fyodor died without an heir in 1598, marking the end of the Rurik dynasty's direct male line, which had ruled for over 7 centuries. The extinction of the Rurik dynasty plunged Russia into unprecedented anarchy and civil war. Boris Godunov reigned 1598 to 1605. A capable boyar who had effectively ruled during Fyodor's reign was elected Tsar by the Zemsky Sobor. His rule was pragmatic and sought to strengthen the country, including attempts at educational reform and foreign policy initiatives. However, his reign was plagued by severe challenges, including a devastating famine from 1601 to 1603, exacerbated by poor harvests and government ineptitude in distribution, that led to widespread suffering and social unrest. This created fertile ground for impostors. The most prominent of these was the first false Dmitri, claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's younger son Dmitri, who had mysteriously died in Uklich in 1591, widely believed to have been murdered on Godunov's orders. Though some posited an accident, this pretender gained support from disaffected Russian boyars, Cossacks, and crucially, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which saw an opportunity to expand its influence. False Dmitri marched on Moscow, attracting a growing following, and after Boris Godunov's sudden death in 1605, possibly by poisoning or suicide, he entered Moscow and was crowned Tsar. His brief reign 1605 to 1606 was marked by attempts at reform and a perceived pro-Polish stance, which alienated many, leading to his assassination by a boyar conspiracy. The death of false Dmitri led to a deepening of the crisis. Vasily Shuing reigned 1606. A leading boyar who led the conspiracy was proclaimed Tsar, but his authority was weak and contested. The country descended into full-scale civil war, characterized by multiple pretenders, including the second false Dmitri, who also claimed to be the miraculously saved Dmitri, and established a rival court in Tushino, outside Moscow. Peasant revolts, most notably the large-scale uprising led by Ivan Bolotnikov, a former serf and military commander, advocating for social equality and widespread brigandage. Foreign intervention became overt. Poland-Lithuania launched a full-scale invasion, capturing Smolensk and even occupying Moscow in 1610, aiming to place the Polish Prince Władysław the Vasa on the Russian throne. Sweden also intervened, occupying Novgorod and parts of the north, seeking territorial gains. Russia was on the verge of losing its independence and disintegrating entirely. The nadir of the Troubles, however, sparked a powerful popular resurgence. Faced with the existential threat of foreign domination and utter anarchy, patriotic forces, spearheaded by the Orthodox Church, Patriarch Hermogen played a crucial role, and led by popular heroes like Kuzma Minin, a merchant from Nizhny Novgorod, and Prince Dmitry Pozarsky, a military commander, rallied the disparate Russian forces. They organized a powerful second volunteer army, raising funds and recruiting soldiers from across the land. This national militia marched on Moscow and, in 1612, successfully expelled the Polish-Lithuanian garrisons from the Kremlin. With the immediate foreign threat repelled and central authority restored, the need for a legitimate and unifying ruler became paramount. in 1613, a Zemsky Sobor was convened, representing all social classes of Russia. After much deliberation, the assembly elected Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov as the new Tsar. Mikhail, a 16-year-old boy, was chosen largely because of his relatively distant connection to the previous political intrigues, his perceived piety, and his lineage through Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan the Terrible's first and popular wife, which gave him a degree of legitimacy. His father, Patriarch Filaret, who had been held captive in Poland, returned and effectively co-ruled with him, providing crucial guidance and stability. The election of Mikhail Romanov marked the end of the time of troubles and the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for over 3 centuries, from 1613 until the 1917 revolution. The initial years of the Romanov dynasty were dedicated to restoring order, rebuilding the shattered economy, and recovering lost territories, gradually bringing stability back to the vast and scarred Russian lands. The election of Mikhail Romanov marked the end of the time of troubles and the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for over 3 centuries, from 1613 until the 1917 revolution. The initial years of the Romanov dynasty were dedicated to restoring order, rebuilding the shattered economy, and recovering lost territories, gradually bringing stability back to the vast and scarred Russian lands. This period, from the election of Mikhail to the ascension of Peter the Great, would see Russia slowly recover, further consolidate its autocratic power, deepen the bonds of serfdom, and face profound internal challenges, including a major religious schism, before embarking on a dramatic state-driven transformation under a revolutionary monarch. The first Romanov Tsar, Mikhail Fyodorovich, reigned 1613 to 1645, was a young, relatively inexperienced ruler who largely relied on the guidance of his father, Patriarch Filaret, who returned from Polish captivity in 1619 and effectively became co-ruler until his death in 1633. Their primary task was to stabilize the country after the anarchy of the Troubles. This involved ending the ongoing wars with Sweden and Poland-Lithuania. The Treaty of Stolbovo, 1617, with Sweden ceded territories in the northwest and denied Russia direct access to the Baltic Sea for a century, but secured peace. The Truce of Duyulino, 1618, with Poland-Lithuania, while returning some territories, like Smolensk in a later war, forced significant concessions. Domestically, they focused on reasserting central authority, suppressing remaining banditry and pretenders, and rebuilding the shattered administrative and economic infrastructure. The Zemsky Sobor continued to play an important role in legitimizing the new dynasty and advising on key decisions, particularly concerning taxation and war, but its power gradually diminished as the monarchy regained strength. Mikhail was succeeded by his son Alexis I, reigned 1645 to 1676, often called the Quiet. His reign saw a further consolidation of autocratic power and significant territorial expansion. Russia continued its recovery and engaged in successful military campaigns against Poland-Lithuania, notably the 13 Years' War, 1654 to 1667. This treaty was a major diplomatic victory for Russia, securing the return of Smolensk, Kiev, and the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, left bank Ukraine, effectively partitioning Ukraine and bringing it under Russian influence. This expansion brought Russia into closer contact with Western ideas and technologies, as well as the unique Cossack culture of Ukraine. In the east, Russian explorers and fur traders continued their relentless push across Siberia, reaching the Pacific Ocean by the mid-17th century, and incorporating vast new territories into the Muscovite state, albeit with loose control. However, Alexis I's reign was also marked by profound internal crises and social unrest that would shape Russian society for centuries. The most significant social development was the deepening of serfdom. While serfdom had been gradually increasing for centuries, the Sobornoye Ulozhenie law code of 1649 codified and formalized its complete establishment, legally binding peasants to the land and to their landlords. This monumental legal document essentially turned serfs into property, defining their lack of freedom and tying their descendants to the same status. This was done to secure the tax base and military service of the nobility, ensuring state stability, but at the cost of the vast majority of the population's freedom, setting the stage for centuries of social tension and sporadic revolts. Simultaneously, the mid-17th century saw a major religious schism within the Russian Orthodox Church, known as the Raskol Schism, initiated by Patriarch Nikon, appointed 1652. These reforms aimed to bring Russian Orthodox liturgical practices and church books into conformity with the more contemporary Greek Orthodox practices, correcting perceived errors and inconsistencies that had accumulated over centuries of isolation. The reforms included changes to the spelling of Jesus' name, the number of fingers used to make the sign of the cross, from 2 to 3, the direction of religious processions, and the texts of service books. While intended to strengthen the Church and its unity with other Orthodox churches, these reforms met fierce resistance from a significant portion of the clergy and common people who viewed them as a betrayal of true orthodoxy and an affront to Russian spiritual distinctiveness, seeing them as an imposition of foreign customs. Those who rejected the reforms became known as Old Believers, Raskolniki. They faced severe persecution from both the state and the official church, including execution, torture, and exile. The schism led to a permanent division within Russian Orthodoxy, profoundly impacting Russian society and culture, fostering a deep-seated distrust of authority among Old Believers, and driving many to seek refuge in remote regions of Russia, preserving their traditional ways and beliefs, often against great odds. The social and religious tensions of the era erupted into widespread peasant and Cossack revolts. The most formidable of these was the uprising, led by Stenka Razin, 1670. Razin, a Don Cossack, rallied a massive force of disaffected peasants, serfs, Cossacks, and non-Russian ethnic groups, promising freedom from serfdom and oppressive state taxes. His rebellion swept through the Volga region, capturing major cities like Astrakhan and laying siege to others, shaking the foundations of the Romanov state. Though eventually brutally suppressed, with Razin captured and quartered in Moscow, his rebellion highlighted the deep social grievances simmering beneath the surface of the autocratic state, and served as a powerful, enduring symbol of popular resistance against serfdom and central authority. These internal challenges demonstrated the fragility of order, even as the Romanovs consolidated power, underscoring the need for a stronger, more unified state from the perspective of the monarchy. The reign of Fyodor III, reigned 1676 to 1682. Alexis's eldest surviving son, was brief and relatively uneventful, marked by the abolition of the Mesnik-Meshtiko system, a complex system of precedents based on noble family lineage that hampered military and administrative appointments. His death without an heir led to a succession crisis, temporarily resulting in the co-rule of his sickly half-brother Ivan Farth and his half-sister Sophia Alexievna, until the decisive emergence of Peter I Alexievich, later known as Peter the Great, reigned 1682 to 1725, sole rule from 1696. Peter the Great's reign represents the most dramatic and comprehensive period of state-driven reform and westernization in Russian history. Born in 1672, Peter's upbringing was unconventional. He spent much of his youth outside the traditional confines of the Kremlin, preferring the company of commoners, soldiers, and foreign experts in the German quarter of Moscow. He developed an insatiable curiosity for practical skills, particularly shipbuilding, navigation, and military engineering. This early exposure to European ideas and technologies, combined with his immense energy and ruthless determination, fueled his lifelong ambition to transform Russia into a powerful modern European state. The defining moment of Peter's early reign was the Grand Embassy to Western Europe, 1697 to 1698. Disguised as a common carpenter, Peter travelled extensively through the Netherlands, England, and other European countries, meticulously studying shipbuilding, military technology, industrial production, and Western administrative practices. This experience profoundly convinced him of Russia's backwardness relative to the West, and solidified his resolve for radical top-down reforms. He abruptly cut short his embassy due to the Streltsy uprising, a revolt by the old musketeer regiments back in Moscow, which he brutally suppressed upon his return, further signalling his intention to break with old traditions and eliminate any opposition to his reforms. Peter's reforms were sweeping, often brutal, and touched virtually every aspect of Russian life. His primary objective was to build a powerful military capable of asserting Russia's presence on the European stage and securing vital ice-free ports, particularly on the Baltic Sea. This led to the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, against the dominant power of Sweden under its brilliant but ultimately reckless young king, Charles the. The war began disastrously for Russia, with the crushing defeat at the Battle of Narva, where Peter's nascent army was annihilated. Undeterred, Peter implemented radical military reforms. He introduced universal conscription for all social classes, a 25-year term for peasants and townspeople, forcing mass recruitment, modernized the army along Western lines, uniforms, drills, weapons, and crucially, established a formidable Russian navy from scratch, building dockyards and bringing in foreign experts. These reforms transformed Russia into a major military power. The turning point of the war came with the decisive Russian victory at the Battle of Poltava, 1709, where Peter's reformed army utterly crushed Charles XII's Swedish forces. This victory marked the end of Swedish dominance in the Baltic and the emergence of Russia as a leading European power. The war finally concluded with the Treaty of Nystad, 1721, granting Russia vast new territories on the Baltic coast, including Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and part of Karelia, finally securing Peter's long-sought window to Europe. To solidify Russia's new European orientation and provide a direct link to the West, Peter undertook the monumental project of building a new capital city, St. Petersburg, on marshy, inhospitable land at the mouth of the Neva River on the Baltic coast. Founded in 1703, the construction of St. Petersburg was a brutal undertaking, costing tens of thousands of lives from disease, harsh conditions, and forced labor, but it quickly rose as a magnificent, planned European-style city, complete with grand palaces, wide avenues, and canals. In 1712, Peter moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, a symbolic break with Russia's old traditional past and a decisive embrace of its new European identity. Peter's administrative reforms aimed to create a more efficient, centralized, and rationalized bureaucracy. He abolished the old, often inefficient Prikazi departments and replaced them with colleges ministries, modeled after Swedish and German systems, each responsible for a specific area of governance, e.g. foreign affairs, finance, justice. He established the governing Senate in 1711, a supreme governing body appointed by the Tsar, responsible for overseeing administration and legislation in the Tsar's absence. Perhaps his most significant social and administrative reform was the Table of Ranks, 1722. This groundbreaking system replaced the old hereditary boyar system of precedence with a meritocratic hierarchy based on service to the state in both civil and military spheres. It allowed commoners to rise in society and attain noble status through service, creating a loyal professional elite dependent on the Tsar, further undermining the old aristocracy. His church reforms were equally radical and designed to subordinate the Orthodox Church directly to the state. After the death of Patriarch Adrian in 1700, Peter refused to appoint a new patriarch, eventually abolishing the Patriarchate altogether in 1721. He replaced it with the Holy Synod, a collegial body headed by a lay official, the Oberprocurator, directly appointed by the Tsar. This made the Church a department of the state, ensuring its subservience to the Tsar's will and removing any potential challenge to his absolute authority. Economically, Peter pursued a policy of mercantilism, aiming to make Russia self-sufficient and increase its wealth through state intervention. He encouraged the development of new industries, mining, metallurgy, textiles, often using forced serf labor, built canals to facilitate trade, and imposed heavy taxes, including the notorious poll tax levied on every male soul to fund his ambitious military and administrative projects. He also pursued policies of westernization in social and cultural life, often enforced with compulsion. He ordered men to shave their traditional beards, a symbol of Russian orthodoxy, or pay a tax, decreed that courtiers and officials wear Western-style clothing, and promoted the study of European languages and sciences. He established the first Russian newspaper, Vedomosti, and founded schools, including naval and engineering academies. In 1721, after the victory in the Great Northern War, Peter officially proclaimed Russia an empire, and himself its emperor, signifying its new status as a major European power. Peter the Great died in 1725, leaving behind a vastly transformed but deeply contradictory legacy. He had dragged Russia into the modern age, built a powerful army and navy, established a new capital, and laid the foundations for a centralized autocratic empire. However, these achievements came at an immense human cost: heavy taxation, widespread forced labor, increased serfdom, and brutal repression of dissent. His reforms created a deep cultural chasm between the westernized elite and the traditional, largely uncomprehending peasantry. His reign irrevocably set Russia on a European path, but one defined by a unique blend of autocratic rule, state control, and a constant, often brutal, striving for modernization from above. The question of whether Russia was truly European or still distinct remained, and would continue to shape its identity for centuries. The question of whether Russia was truly European or still distinct remained, and would continue to shape its identity for centuries. Following Peter the Great's death in 1725, Russia entered a period often characterized as the era of palace revolutions, 1725 to 1762, marked by weak and short-lived rulers, often elevated to the throne by influential noble factions and guard regiments. This era saw frequent changes in leadership and a general struggle between the Petrine legacy of strong centralized reform and the resurgence of aristocratic influence. Figures like Catherine I, Peter II, Anna Ivanovna, and Ivan VI briefly occupied the throne, but true power often resided with favourites and the imperial guard. It was under Elizabeth Petrovna, reigned 1741 to 1762, Peter the Great's daughter, that Russia saw a return to Petrine grandeur. She abolished the internal customs duties, strengthened the nobility's privileges, though still tied to service, and presided over a period of artistic and intellectual flourishing, including the founding of Moscow University in 1755 and the Imperial Academy of Arts. Her reign solidified Russia's role in European diplomacy and warfare, notably during the 7 Years' War, where Russian forces even occupied Berlin. However, her death left the throne to her German nephew, Peter III. Peter III reigned 1762. A fervent admirer of Frederick the Great of Prussia, abruptly withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War, alienating the military and nobility. His unpopular pro-Prussian policies and perceived disrespect for Russian traditions led to a swift coup orchestrated by his ambitious German wife Catherine II, who swiftly ascended to the throne as Catherine the Great. Catherine's reign is justly considered a second golden age for the Russian Empire, following Peter the Great's, initially embracing the ideals of enlightened absolutism. She corresponded with leading European intellectuals like Voltaire and Diderot, proclaiming her intention to modernize Russia along Western lines. She introduced some reforms, such as the creation of the Legislative Commission in 1767 to revise Russian law, though it ultimately failed to produce a new code, and some limited measures to promote education and legal reform. However, her reformist zeal was significantly curtailed by the massive Pugachev's Rebellion, 1773 to 1775, led by Emelian Pugachev, a Don Cossack who claimed to be the miraculously saved Peter III. This was the largest peasant uprising in Russian history, encompassing Cossacks, serfs, factory workers, and non-Russian ethnic groups, promising freedom from serfdom and oppressive state taxes. Its brutal suppression, involving the execution of Pugachev, instilled in Catherine a deep-seated fear of social upheaval. Consequently, her later policies became more conservative, tightening the bonds of serfdom and strengthening noble privileges through the Charter to the Nobility, 1785, which exempted nobles from compulsory state service and taxation, giving them unprecedented rights over their estates and serfs. Despite the shift towards conservatism internally, Catherine's foreign policy was extraordinarily successful, vastly expanding the Russian Empire's territory and securing its place as a dominant European power. Her key strategic goal was to gain full control over the northern Black Sea coast, pushing back the Ottoman Empire and acquiring access to the Mediterranean. Through 2 successful wars with the Ottoman Empire, Russia secured the Crimea and significant territories along the Black Sea, Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainaji, 1774, and Treaty of Jassy, 1792, laying the foundation for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. This allowed for significant agricultural development in the fertile New Russia region. Catherine also spearheaded the partitions of Poland. Weakened by internal strife and foreign interference, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was carved up by Russia, Prussia and Austria in 3 stages, 1772, 1795. Russia gained the lion's share, acquiring vast swathes of White Russia, Lithuania and Ukraine, nearly doubling its population and expanding its western borders deep into Europe, thereby reuniting many of the old Russia lands. By the end of her reign, Russia was firmly established as one of the great European powers, with its territory stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, and from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Catherine was succeeded by her son, the eccentric and volatile Paul I, reigned 1796 to 1801. Paul reversed many of his mother's policies, particularly those favouring the nobility, attempting to re-establish autocratic control and a stricter social order. His reforms included measures to limit noble power, reduce serfdom, albeit minimally, and improve military discipline, but his unpredictable behaviour and growing paranoia alienated many. He was eventually assassinated in a palace coup, likely with the tacit approval of his son, Alexander. Alexander a Font, reigned 1801 to 1825, began his reign with promises of liberal reform, granting amnesties, abolishing the secret police, and initiating cautious steps toward constitutionalism, establishing a state council and new ministries. However, his reign became largely defined by the Napoleonic Wars. After initial defeats, Russia joined various European coalitions against France. The pivotal moment came in 1812 with Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia. Despite the burning of Moscow, the strategic retreat, the harsh Russian winter, and relentless guerrilla warfare decimated Napoleon's Grand Army, forcing a humiliating retreat. Alexander the Font then played a crucial role in the subsequent European campaigns that led to Napoleon's downfall, culminating in the Congress of Vienna, 1815, where Russia emerged as a dominant force in European politics, a staunch defender of the conservative order. Towards the end of his reign, disillusioned by the failure of his liberal reforms and influenced by the rise of mysticism and conservative reaction across Europe, Alexander became increasingly autocratic and repressive. His unexpected death in 1825 led to a brief but significant crisis. The crisis of succession in 1825 was marked by the Decembrist Revolt, a group of liberal-minded noble army officers, many influenced by Enlightenment ideals and experiences in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, attempted a military coup in St. Petersburg to demand a constitution and abolish serfdom. The revolt was poorly organised and swiftly crushed by the new Tsar. Nicholas I reigned 1825. The Decembrist uprising profoundly shaped Nicholas's reign, convincing him of the dangers of liberalism and revolution. He became known as the Gendarme of Europe and Iron Tsar, a staunch defender of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality, the official nationality doctrine formulated by Count Ovarov. His reign was characterized by rigid centralization, widespread censorship, a powerful secret police, the Third Section, and the suppression of any perceived dissent. Despite his conservatism, Nicholas also recognized Russia's technological backwardness and initiated some modernization efforts, particularly in military and infrastructure development, e.g. the first major railway lines. However, his policies ultimately failed to address Russia's fundamental problems, particularly the pervasive institution of serfdom, which remained a moral and economic burden. His foreign policy focused on maintaining the conservative order and expanding Russian influence in the Balkans, ultimately leading to the disastrous Crimean War 1853 to 1856, against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Russia's defeat exposed its technological, military, and administrative backwardness compared to the leading Western powers, revealing the urgent need for fundamental reform. The humiliating defeat in the Crimean War forced Nicholas's successor, Alexander II, reigned 1855 to 1881, to embark on a series of transformative reforms known as the Great Reforms. Recognizing that serfdom was both a moral evil and an economic impediment, his most momentous act was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. While hailed as a liberation, the emancipation was flawed. Peasants received personal freedom but were required to pay redemption payments to their former landlords for allocated land, often insufficient for self-sufficiency, leading to continued poverty and resentment. Other significant reforms included the judicial reform of 1864, which introduced an independent judiciary, public trials, and trial by jury, marking a radical departure from the previous arbitrary system. Local self-government was introduced through the establishment of Zemstvos, 1864, elected local councils responsible for education, healthcare, and infrastructure, providing some limited local autonomy and a new sphere for public participation. Military reforms reduced the term of service and introduced universal conscription, creating a more modern army. Despite these sweeping changes, Alexander II maintained the autocratic principle, refusing to grant a constitution or a national representative assembly. His reforms, while progressive, often fell short of expectations and failed to fully address the deep social inequalities and burgeoning revolutionary movements. Ironically, despite his reforms, Alexander II faced growing radical opposition, including nihilists and populists, Narodniki, leading to several assassination attempts. He was ultimately assassinated by a terrorist bomb in 8. His successor, Alexander III, reigned 1881 to 1894, reacted sharply against his father's liberal policies. A staunch conservative, he implemented a period of counter-reforms, aiming to restore autocratic order and suppress revolutionary tendencies. He curtailed the powers of the Zemstvos, tightened censorship, increased police surveillance, and rolled back judicial reforms. His reign also saw the infamous surge of anti-Jewish pogroms. Economically, however, his finance minister, Sergei Witte, initiated significant state-sponsored industrialization, focusing on railway construction, including the Trans-Siberian Railway and heavy industry, leading to rapid, though socially disruptive, economic growth. The last Tsar of Russia was Nicholas II, reigned 1894 to 90, well-intentioned but weak-willed and deeply committed to preserving his autocratic power. Nicholas inherited a rapidly industrializing empire grappling with immense social tensions, a disenfranchised peasantry, a growing and exploited industrial working class, a frustrated intelligentsia, and various national minorities demanding autonomy. Economic growth brought prosperity to some, but also deepened class divides and urban poverty. Russia's expansionist foreign policy, particularly in the Far East, led to the disastrous Russo-Japanese War 1904 to 1900, where Russia suffered humiliating defeats on land and sea. This defeat, coupled with persistent social unrest, ignited the Revolution of a peaceful demonstration on Bloody Sunday, where imperial guards fired on unarmed protesters, sparked widespread strikes, mutinies, and peasant uprisings across the empire. Forced to concede, Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, granting civil liberties and establishing the Duma, a legislative assembly. While the Duma was often circumvented and its powers limited by the Tsar, it marked a significant, albeit reluctant, step towards constitutional monarchy. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin attempted further agrarian reforms to create a class of prosperous peasant landowners and stabilize the countryside, but his efforts were cut short by his assassination in 9. By the early 20th century, Russia remained an autocracy, struggling to adapt to modern challenges. Its internal problems were exacerbated by its involvement in World War I, 1914 to 1918. The war placed immense strain on Russia's already fragile economy and outdated infrastructure. Millions of casualties, chronic food shortages, rampant inflation, and the Tsar's perceived incompetence, especially after he personally took command of the army, fueled widespread discontent and eroded public trust in the monarchy. The Tsarina Alexandra's reliance on the controversial mystic Rasputin further undermined the prestige of the imperial family. The culmination of these accumulated pressures erupted in February 1917, marked by the Gregorian calendar. Widespread strikes and bread riots in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, escalated into a full-blown uprising, joined by mutinous soldiers. Unable to control the situation, and lacking support from even his own generals, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate on March 15, 1917, bringing an end to the 304-year-old Romanov dynasty and over 1,000 years of continuous monarchical rule in Russia. This pivotal moment opened the door to the provisional government, and ultimately to the October Revolution of 1917 and the rise of the Bolsheviks, ushering in a completely new and revolutionary chapter in Russian history.